Good morning. Thank you very much, Lorraine. I'm going to do a quick run-through of our new Sea Lice Regulatory Framework. So this will be of most interest, I guess, to all of you on the West Coast, Western Isles and Northern Isles. So I'll speak. So from 1st of February, this year, we've now got a new Sea Lice Regulatory Framework in place for the first time. SEPA's taking on the regulation of sea lice from finfish farms and their interaction with salmon and, in March 2025, sea trout. So what that means is from the beginning of 8 February, all development proposals, new farms, expansion of existing farms in the seas around the West Coast and Western Isles are subject to this new Sea Lice Risk Assessment Framework, regulatory framework. From March, that will extend to the Northern Isles and sea trout, and we'll be starting to add conditions to the permits of existing farms from March 2025. Okay, and so what this framework is focused on, it's focused on that little pest on the left, the infective stage sea louse. What we're trying to do is manage concentrations in the environment of that louse so they don't reach levels that will lead to harmful numbers of lice on the salmon as they leave the rivers and head off to the high seas. The framework is focused on those bottlenecks to migration as the post-smolts leave the rivers and head through sea lochs where they've all got to get through those sea lochs, and it's also where concentrations of fish farms can be located as well. So we're focused on bottlenecks, sea lochs, sounds, other enclosed areas before they get into the more open sea. It's based on setting up a series of wild salmon protection zones in all these bottlenecks around the West Coast and Western Isles. There are large numbers of these. Some are just small around river mouths and some are quite extensive, like the big sea loch systems of Loch Linney and Loch Fyne. And the framework is then based on assessing the risk to post-smolts as they navigate their way through these wild salmon protection zones. And how that works is that we use modelling to model the concentration of infective stage sea lice in these zones, and then we model the movement of, I'm going to call them virtual salmon smolts, from the rivers leading into these protection zones. And so we might run several thousand virtual smolts, and we then explore the potential exposure to sea lice that they experience to assess the risk. So for example, in the Loch Fyne system, we've run over nearly 30,000 virtual smolts to assess through that April-May period what exposure to lice they experience, and then we can make an assessment of the risk. And here's an example of that in a different system, Loch Linney. There's, again, large numbers of virtual smolts sent down every few hours through the April-May period, through different routes to the open sea, and we assess the exposure that they experience on their way through, and then compare that with an exposure threshold indicating a risk that they may experience harmful levels of exposure to infective stage sea lice. Okay, so it's a risk framework based on modelling, quite sophisticated modelling, factors in the concentrations of lice, but also the movement of fish through the zone, and that's where things like West Coast Tracking Project can help refine the tracks that we've assumed that the salmon take. Okay, but this is quite an important step. It's the first time we had a robust, disappearing again. First time we've had a robust risk assessment framework based on sophisticated modelling of development proposals to manage the risk. And it's now come into place from the 1st of February. What it really involves is a developer will ask us to consider a development proposal at pre-application stage. We'll run that screening assessment using those types of models which I've just described. Sometimes the model will say no problem. Sometimes it will say further assessment's needed. If further assessment is needed, there's options for the developer. They can choose an alternative location. They can build in mitigation into the design of their farm. For example, they could farm shorter cycle and miss that smolt migration period, a 12-month cycle around the avoiding the migration period. Or they could go away and work with us to do a more refined model and to demonstrate that there isn't a risk. And of course, if our screen does not pose any risk, then they go ahead and we'll put appropriate risk-based conditions on their permits. Okay, I wanted to talk now about, that's one good thing for new farms, expansive farms, really taking over where local authorities were the lead regulator. We're now the lead regulator. We're also going to look at the pressure from existing farms. So make sure we don't get new farms or expansive farms causing an additional risk. We're also looking at the pressure from existing farms. Again, we'll use that same screening to prioritise where we look, and the further assessment will be targeted where we do that, and that's going to be delivered through monitoring that we'll lead and organise and refined modelling to really understand the impact of existing farms. And that will determine whether action is required or not. And if the action is required, it will involve us driving down the numbers of lice on those farms through regulatory action. So we've done that initial screen of existing farms and their effects around the coast of Western Isles and the West Coast. What I've shown there is on the left is the main wild salmon protection zones, which the initial screen is suggesting we need to look more because there may be a risk to wild salmon. So you'll see the obvious ones, like they're the big zones, lots of farms and really a long migratory route for the salmon through the zone to the open sea. So there's more time to be exposed. So there's big areas around east of Skye, Loch Linney, Loch Fyne are coming out very clearly there. The other thing that's coming out from the screening model, and it's typical of a lot of things we model, is that a relatively small proportion of farms contribute a majority of the exposure risk. And that's because they're in a location, which means the lice that they release into the environment hangs around in the protection zone, whereas other farms it gets dispersed widely. So what we're seeing is farms that are generally located far up into a sea loch system contribute much more than farms that are further out, as you might expect. Those are the focus areas where we're going to target the next phase of monitoring and modelling. So, and that's really what I wanted to say as a sort of final area I want to talk about, is our priority work for this year is focusing on the pressure from existing farms so that we get a better understanding of where there are real impacts that we need to address and drive down lice numbers on those farms. The two main strands of that work are the monitoring work, and there are several elements to that monitoring work. The first one I've called sentinel cages, and that is really putting out farmed smolts into pens in the sea loch systems that we're looking at, which we'll do alongside the operators to make sure the models we've done are reflecting what the environment is experiencing. So it allows us to test the skill of the model against real data in the environment from the lice that picked up on smolts held in these fixed cages for short periods. So that's a really important part of the modelling. It gets the confidence in the models, and the confidence is really important to enable us to then take decisions. Yeah, I keep disappearing. Get back again. Okay. The second strand is really wanting to pick up, and this is where working with some of you will be really important, is the evidence from lice on sea trout from fyke netting and sweep netting. Again, we're going to do that for two reasons. We want to understand that information will help as another layer of building confidence in our models are telling us about the world, how the world is. So it builds a confidence in the models. And the second reason is it will underpin the sea trout framework that we're bringing in from March 2025. I'm not going to cover that much here, but sea trout is going to be an important thing, and that netting and fight netting and sweep netting is really important for both the sea trout and for adding extra confidence around our salmon framework. And it's an area where we all need your help as we transition from the current arrangements, for example, for the environmental management plans for local authorities, to SEPA taking on that role. Okay. The third element of the monitoring I want to talk about is the juvenile stocks. What we will be doing, we're planning an initial program this year. Sorry, I should have said the sentinel cage work we're hoping to deploy in October. So it doesn't matter it's outside the migration window, it's still going to tell us if the models are reflecting distribution of lice in the areas. So we've got that planned for October, all being well, September, October. We're looking at starting this summer juvenile stock monitoring. What we're trying to do there is get, if you like, paired catchments. For the first time, we can now look at rivers that go into areas with relatively high lice concentrations and those that go into low lice concentrations. We want to pair those, try and pick catchments that are all else, they're pretty similar, and then we can understand the differences that might be seen. We're looking for differences between that are due to sea lice pressure. So that's building the evidence base that sea lice are causing a contribution to the status of the stocks. So it's paired catchments and juvenile. But we also want to explore in a similar sort of paired catchment way, using tagging studies, a bit like the Loch Laxford one, to see if that has the potential as another way of disentangling what's happening with catchments that have low lice pressure versus high lice pressure. The other area we're looking at is... That's my phone, isn't it? That's very unusual. The speaker is the one that causes the phone. Right, I'm going to lose some brownie points. Model development is the other area. So we're going to build... I said we've got models already. We're working with the modelling community in Scotland to develop the next generation, if you like, of sophisticated models to run in these high-risk catchments. So that work's ongoing. We've got a modelling group going on. And the final area of priority work for this year is putting the permit limits on existing farms where they're needed. So we're planning that work during this year, and then we'll introduce permit limits. Those will not be limits to drive down lice at this stage. They'll be to make sure that the operators maintain a good level of performance going forward. The other thing I want to say about the monitoring and model development we want to do it collaboratively. We're setting up governance groups which will lead, but will have stakeholders involved. I'm very much hoping that Fisheries Management Scotland and some of the members will be really keen to involve both at the steering group level and the delivery group levels of that. We will be raising charges on the fish farmers to fund some of the monitoring work. And that will replace the EMP routes of funding in due course. The other thing we want to do this very internationally. We have now got a grant funding arrangement with the Institute of Marine Research in Norway, and they will be working alongside us on the sentinel cage work. We've also just let a big grant to develop a new model, a better model for Shetland and parts of the West Coast, which we'll be working alongside Marine Directorate colleagues to make use of that model. So we're going to get better models for the Northern Islands in particular, and we're going to get a lot of international help on the monitoring design. So the main message is today, got a new Sea Lice Regulatory Framework in place. So for me, that's another, of all the pressures on salmon, we're slowly making sure we've got a good, robust framework in place to deal with them. This is the latest one that we're fixing. We've now got a framework in place to help regulate that pressure. We'll cover sea trout from March 2025. And we're really keen, as I've said, really keen to get your experience and help with monitoring parts of this framework.